This is the International Soccer Preview, and we are Soccer Files Canada. Welcome to Series 17. We're looking at the squads of the 2023 Gold Cup. This is the short version for Guadeloupe's players. Here we go. We're back and we have looked at the preliminary squad and the final squad for Guadeloupe. And we are now prepared to go through the list that we made in part one. In part one, we listed the players. I'm saying this on behalf of the people just joining us for the short version of the podcast. In part one, we made a list of players, basically players who had played for the squad recently, and we categorized them according to how likely they were to make the team. And if you want that information, you can go back. It basically gives some biographical information on the players and tells why we are assessing them the way we're assessing them. I'll give maybe one example as we go through here. And let's get on with it. So let's see who made the team. So we begin with the manager, Jocelyn Angloma. And no changes there. He did make the team. Okay, and then on to goalkeepers. So as an example, and we did notice a pattern in part one of basically new players recruited from France, some of them from Guadeloupe, new players in Guadeloupe, basically replacing the old guard. Many of the players from the 2021 Gold Cup, and there's no better example of it than the goalkeepers here. So I'll just give an example. We had a definite candidate in Davy Rouard, and he just joined the team in 2022. But he got his first cap in June 2022, started 5 of their remaining 8 games, and was on the bench for the 3 others. So he looks like he is in. Actually, he's not a great example because he's not one of the players born in France, recruited in France. He was born in Guadeloupe, but hopefully you get the picture. The other one, Bryce Cognard, actually was recruited from France. He's 33 years old and just joined Guadeloupe in 2022, and similarly has come into the picture fully. And the other candidate at the possible level, Willie Laguerre, all 3 of those players making it to the final squad, and at the expense, as it were, to Johan Lillian Thuram, who was the starting keeper in the 2021 Gold Cup, and who started the first 2 games after the Gold Cup in 2022, and then has not been selected or listed even since then. And the same is true for Kevin Ajax, who last played for the national team in March 2022. So more than a year ago, although he was a backup keeper in the Gold Cup. So both of those goalkeepers replaced, it seems, by new players, some of them recruited from France. Kevin Ajax, by the way, did make the preliminary squad at least, but Johan Thuram did not. So I won't harp on about that pattern. You'll kind of see it if you watch part one of the media cast, but that pattern kind of goes all the way through here. All right, let's do the business we're supposed to do in part 2, and we move on to central defenders. So we had a whole bunch of them. We had 2 definite candidates. So Anthony Baron did make the final squad, and Andrew Gravillon also made the final squad. We had 4 likely candidates, and all of them made the squad. So Cedric Abignel, Ronan Hauteville, Mehdi Lina, and Nathaniel Santini, all of them making the squad. And we had one possible candidate in Steve Solvet, and he also made the squad. So very rich in central defence, but what we talked about in part 1 was probably some of these players are playing in the midfield, which is a bit thin, because a lot of these players are starting games, so they can't all be starting in central defence. Our possible but unlikely candidate, Stevenson Casimir, did make the preliminary squad, but not the final squad. But the player who seemed to be off the team, Nicholas St. Ruff, does prove to be off the team, at least here, and he was not selected even for the preliminary squad. Okay, moving on to left backs, we had a candidate just at the possible level, and that was Jerome Roussillon. And Jerome Roussillon only made the preliminary squad, but not the final squad. And then we had three players seemingly off the squad. Kelly Irab actually hadn't shown up for the team since the 2021 Gold Cup and is not selected even for the preliminary squad here. And nor is Morgan Jean-Pierre. However, Thomas Pino, who we had as seemingly off the squad, is not quite off the squad because he made the preliminary squad, although he didn't make the final cut. Okay, moving over to right backs, we had two likely candidates, and the first was Mikhail Alphonse, and he did make the squad. The other one, Dimitri Caver, apparently was named to the preliminary squad, maybe in hopes that he would recover from his injury, but we knew in part one that he was injured, and it seems like that prevents his participation here because he's on the preliminary squad but not the final squad. So we'll review that at the end too when we summarize the information, and meanwhile we'll move on to the midfield and defensive midfielders. So we begin with a likely candidate in Quentin Annette, and he did make the final squad. And so did the possible candidate, Jordan Leborn, making the squad for the Gold Cup in 2023 here. We had two players who were seemingly off the squad, but actually one of them, Morgan St. Maximin, did make the preliminary squad, but not the final squad, while Kevin Malpon, sometimes known as Edwin Malpon, did not even make the preliminary squad there. In the central midfielder, surprisingly, we only had one candidate, but he was at the likely level. That's Johan Rotzen. And Johan Rotzen is on the squad for the Gold Cup. He made it. We had no left midfielders. As you can see, the midfield very thin here. And for right midfielders, we had one likely candidate, Dimitri Ramoth, and he did make the Gold Cup squad. And the player who seemed to be off the squad, Olivier Serrain, not selected even for the preliminary squad. So he does seem to be off the squad. Left winger, we had a definite candidate, Ange Freddy Plumet, and he is one of the kind of the recruits coming in, and he made the squad. However, veteran Gregory Gendry did not make the squad, just the preliminary squad for the 36-year-old Gendry. For right wingers, we had no candidates, but we finished the midfield with a general midfielder, Livio Damas Agis, who seemed to be off the squad, and that proves to be the case, as he was not selected even for the preliminary squad. In the forwards, we begin with attacking midfielders, and there we only had one candidate too, so a bit weak all through the midfield, except defensive midfielders. And Vikash Thiel was a possible candidate, but did make the Gold Cup squad. We had no players coded as secondary strikers, but we had quite a few forwards on the list here. And the two definite candidates, Matthias Phaeton and Thierry Ambrose, both made the final squad. And then among the 4 possible candidates we had, all of them made it. So Luther Archimedes, Stephen Devadas, Jeffrey Durbon, and Jordan Tell. All 4 of those forwards making it. I'm sure they'll also fill in the midfield, attacking midfield, and perhaps the winger positions there. And then we had, again, this pattern of the new players replacing the old ones. We had the Sylvain Merveille, who was a starter in the 2021 Gold Cup, not selected even for the preliminary squad here, and nor was Florian David. So both of those players are indeed off the squad. And that's it. We're going to finish here with just some summaries. So we begin with notable non-selections. And there are none. I mean, in general, we would say those players who were kind of firmly on the team up through the 2021 Gold Cup and up through the early games in 2022, but then who suddenly disappeared in March or in June 2022, kind of replaced by newer players or by some recruits from France. Kind of notable non-selections, but they haven't played for a year. So even in our initial list, we had them as seemingly off the squad. Otherwise, everyone who was selected was either a possible, likely, or definite candidate in our first run through the squad in part 1. So no names to add here. And even for surprise inclusions, there really are none. These would be players who we had at the possible but unlikely level, or the seemingly off the squad level, who actually made the final squad. And there are none of those. I'm going to name a couple of players who we had as seemingly off the squad, but they actually made it to the preliminary squad. So they're not off the squad completely. And that is goalkeeper Kevin Ajax, left back Thomas Pinot, and defensive midfielder Morgan St. Maximin. So all of those players still in the picture to a degree by dint of having been named to the preliminary squad. In terms of new players, we don't have any players showing up for the Gold Cup that were not on our list in the first place. We did have a few players show up on the preliminary squad. There were 5 players. One of them was on our list, but he hadn't played for the squad since 2018, so we didn't name him in the first part of the thing, of the media cast. And then the other 4 are brand new players who haven't been even on the bench for Guadeloupe, so kind of named to the preliminary squad based on, I don't know, youth teams or what have you, but they'd never been called up before. So we may see some of those players down the road, but they're not really worth naming here because they would just be names. Finally, we look at injuries, and the only category of injuries we have is a player dropped due to injury, and that's a player we talked about, Dimitri Caver. So we did have him as a likely candidate, but he's been kind of injured on and off, out from his club team with 3 separate injuries since the start of 2022. All of those injuries listed as unknown, but the last one is a significant one. That was an injury from mid-May, also listed as an unknown injury, but the return date also was unknown. And because we did part 1 a bit closer to the Cup than we did for the other teams who qualified much earlier, not through the playoffs, we were pretty doubtful that he was going to be here for this Cup. So Dimitri Caver misses this Cup, and we'll have to see down the road if he makes it to the next one. And that brings us to the end of this media cast, and indeed to the end of the series. I hope you join us for our next series. We're going to do previews for the 2023 Asian Cup and the 2023 African Cup. Both of those are actually in January of 2024. But watch out for our media cast beginning in the late fall or early winter in 2023. We've actually done a preview of the 2023 African Cup qualifying, which is still ongoing. The last games there will be in September, but we're talking about the finals in 2024 that will be coming out in late fall or early winter. And we're also contemplating a series on early qualifying for the 2026 World Cup, which will be starting. A lot of times some of the preliminary rounds and the weaker teams get ignored there. So if there's enough material for us to do a podcast on the early rounds, we will. Meanwhile, enjoy the rest of the Gold Cup. We hope our preview of the team and the players helps deepen your enjoyment. So it's Canada and US relying on bench strength, and Martinique and Guadeloupe relying on French strength.